For Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In responding to me about the cancellation of STC, the Parliamentary Secretary for Transport said the federal government delegates this responsibility to the provinces and the private sector. That's all well and good, Mr. Speaker, but if the province refuses to take responsibility and the private sector declines to take responsibility, which is contrary to a letter I received from the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, and municipalities lack the capacity, what are people supposed to do? Not go to the doctor in the hospital, not attend post-secondary education, not visit family and friends, beg for rides from neighbours or strangers. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is if every level of government is unwilling or unable to provide support, who should vulnerable people turn to? People across Western Canada and from British Columbia to Manitoba and in the northern communities in Quebec and Ontario have already raised the alarm that we are on the cusp of a remote and rural transportation crisis. Mr. Speaker, we know that isolating people in northern, rural and remote areas contributes to poorer health outcomes and poorer quality of health. We have seen the impacts and heard the testimony of the real dangers of no affordable, safe transportation systems when we heard the stories of missing and murdered women, primarily Indigenous women, on the Highway of Tears in British Columbia. The Liberal government committed to help people there stay safe. In my home province of Saskatchewan, the consequences of losing our provincial bus service are already becoming clear. In the months after the closure, several people died trying to get in between cities. One of my constituents was unable to access the medical treatment she required in another city. Elderly people all over the province are losing their independence for want of a bus service. I believe the member opposite and many people outside the province of Saskatchewan believe that STC to be some sort of luxury, that somehow a subway in Toronto or a light rail in Vancouver are worthier of federal support and leadership. In reality, it is not a luxury, and much more important, in my home province of roughly 1 million people, it really does function as our subway. In Saskatchewan, 50% of the population live outside urban centres. We face today, as we have always faced, unique challenges because of this. We need affordable transportation that people can access. The province of Saskatchewan has roads enough to circumvent the earth 7 times. Saskatchewan people need to know that at least the federal government cares about the safety of everyone living in the province. Even a cursory reading of the STC financial statements will reveal that the Sask Party government spent years inflating the costs and then exaggerated their budget for the future. They eliminated service that for many living in remote, rural or northern communities was absolutely essential. Mr. Speaker, I call upon the government to answer one question. If the government delegates responsibility to a province who is unwilling to live up to that responsibility, and the private sector is unable to take up that responsibility, then what are the people of my home province who require that service supposed to do? Will the federal government step forward, find a role, and lead? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport.
I'd like to thank the honourable member from Saskatoon West for her question and for her advocacy on behalf of her communities. We've said it time and time again, no relationship is more important to Canada than its relationship with Indigenous peoples. That's why our government has taken immediate action to better serve Indigenous people and their communities, such as a new gender-based violence strategy, changes to child and family welfare system for Indigenous children, safe housing, shelters, and also working with the province of British Columbia towards safe transport on the Highway of Tears. Our government is making concrete investments now, including $2.6 billion over 5 years, to close gaps in education funding between on and off reserve, and as part of our gender-based violence strategy, construction of 5 new family shelters for those fleeing violence. We are committed to seeing all of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to actions implemented. with more than 2/3 of those under federal or shared responsibility already underway. We do recognize the need for safer transport for rural and Indigenous communities. And with respect to intercity bus services, the provinces must play a leading role in overseeing this sector. This is because under the Federal Motor Vehicle Transport Act, the federal government has indeed delegated the regulation of interprovincial bus carriers in federal jurisdiction to the provinces and territories. This includes establishing conditions of entry or exit or routes and regulating rates and routings. We agree that safe transport is key, and we do encourage the Government of Saskatchewan to consult with Indigenous groups, municipalities, and other stakeholders to find innovative, alternative options for assisting with the provision of safe transportation services for Saskatchewan's people and communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Parliamentary Secretary for her comments. I just want to stress, if there is any way that the people of Saskatchewan really need the federal government to extend a hand, to lead, to offer to help us in some way. People in my province have watched what happened on the Highway of Tears in northern British Columbia, and they are seeing how the federal government stepped in and helped out with safe transportation. Perhaps the federal government, could look at this as an issue for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities in my province, a relationship that she has stated and we have heard they value as most important. However, you look at the issue, whether it's access to health care, as a feminist issue, as a public safety issue, I call upon this government to do something. And will this government work with the people of Saskatchewan to keep our people safe? Thank you.
The honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, our government recognized the need for safer transport for rural, isolated, and Indigenous communities. Our government is working to advance reconciliation and renew that nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. We encourage the Government of Saskatchewan to engage Indigenous communities and other vulnerable stakeholders in conjunction with the remaining bus service providers in the province. Develop a strategy that addresses the need for rural transportation services in the province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.